Okay, so now we are starting our recording, and we, like I said, want to welcome you to the Crones as they come back to our inn here to share some tales. Tonight they're going to share tales of the Maiden, the Mother, and the Crone. And I'm really looking forward to it. There's five of them sitting at that table, so just hopefully they don't get too crazy. Um, I do want to mention that we've also got a couple other events coming up in the future. Next month, we're going to have Turatini, who is going to share us tales from the South Pacific. She lives in New Zealand, and she's doing a workshop on the Saturday following on the storytelling styles of the South Pacific. Both programs look like quite interesting. And in March, we have Tom Rawson, who is going to show up and maybe even be able to regale us with his banjo. We'll see about that. But for the moment, I just want to bring on Allison, as soon as I can find her in the thing here, who is going to introduce our program and then introduce our teller.
Actually, I'm going to introduce the tellers first. So I'd like you to bring on the tellers if you could do that for me,
Okay,
Barry.
Okay, I'll just start doing it here.
So there's Barb Fankhauser, Pam Maben, and Penfound.
Come on. Oh, she moved on me.
One more.
Hang on. Let's see, who am I missing?
Julie. Julie Strozyk is coming.
Julie, yeah, okay. Is she back?
Well, you never know about the Baba Yaga.
Ah, here we go. She was way down the line. Oh, video's turned off. Baga.
Baba. Well, trust me, she's there. You just never know.
There
She is. And then myself, Allison Cox. We are the Crones, and we will be sharing stories with you tonight. But first, I'm going to read you a little excerpt. Probably a storytelling no-no, eh? To read something, but nevertheless, we're breaking rules tonight. So welcome, everyone. I want to share with you this excerpt adapted from the writing of Kate Ballou about the title of our concert tonight. The Maiden, Mother, and Crone, also known as the Triple Goddess. They have been celebrated across cultures for centuries. The Maiden, Mother, and Crone embody the waxing, full, and waning moon and teach us how to live in balance through each phase of our lives. The Triple Goddess rules the intuitive waters where our world and the other world meet. In other words, the land of story. The Maiden, or the waxing moon, is poised at the precipice. She is ready to leave home, go off into the world, and though often depicted as a damsel in distress, the Maiden belongs to no one. She is independent, intelligent, and curious. You have heard of her in stories of the Greek Persephone, the Russian Vasilisa, or the Sumerian Inanna. Now the mother, or the full moon, is fierce and has a fertile mind filled with ideas and undertakings. She teaches us to stand on our own 2 feet once we have come into our own power. You may recognize the mother in stories like the Greek Gaia or the Egyptian Isis. And finally, the crone. Associated with the waning moon is a wise woman aligned with the power of transmutation. She walks along the liminal and is all-knowing. The crone asks us to take a new perspective and to trust ourselves and to let go of what we thought we knew and embrace the intuitive and the magical. You know her through the tales of the Russian Baba Yaga, the Italian La Befana, or the Celtic Cailleach. Now, while these archetypes can stand alone in their own power, they are meant to work together. They are the phases of life, 3 different sides of the same story. And when we meet all 3, we are rewarded with deep, full, wild, and intuitive tales. And so, may the stories begin. The first storyteller tonight is Julie Strozyk, appearing as her alter ego, Baba Yaga, and she will favor us with a story called The Witch in the Sky, a Romani tale from the Czech tradition.
Where are you?
Can you hear me now, darling?
Oh, we can hear you.
Wonderful.
I got to get you on the screen.
Well, I was on the screen, but now I'm not.
You're going to have to wait, Fifi. I'm doing something.
But I'm not moving.
There you are.
There you are.
There I am. Okay. You want to hear a story? I don't know if you'll be able to see me. I don't know if it even matters. I am very upset. But I will tell you a story. You know, you may not be aware of it, but Baba Yaga is very, very old. Much older than you might think. Now, the people of the Roma, they know how old I am. And this story is one that they tell. They say, once upon a time, there was a witch who lived in the sky. Of course, this was back at the beginning of the world. And the sky and the earth were a little of both. Everything was kind of mixed up. It was a regular mess. Maybe one day I would go out and...
It appears that Baba Yaga's chicken house has lost its bandwidth. Can anybody else hear her?
I'm back now. Can you hear me?
Back?
I'm back. I'm back.
Okay.
But if you want to move on, move on.
No.
Go ahead.
All right. I was out walking one day and I noticed something beside me. And I picked it up and looked at it. It was a piece of flint. It was kind of pretty, you know. And so I said, Miss Flint, would you like to live in my pocket for a while? And she seemed to like the idea, so I put the flint in my pocket. And I continued on my walk that day. And then I saw something else down beside me. Oh, I picked it up. It was a piece of steel. It was a handsome piece of steel. And I said, Mr. Steel, how would you like to marry with Mistress Flint and live in my pocket for a while? And he seemed to be agreed. And so I put the steel in the pocket with Miss Flint. And so they were married. And they were happy and they got along just fine. But then one day, I don't know who started it. I don't know how it began. I don't know who hit who. But there was a spark in my pocket. Somebody slapped somebody. It was a big spark. It was burning my apron. I pulled off my apron. I threw it into the sky. And the sparks went everywhere. And I looked at those sparks and I said, you stay up there, all of you. You stay up there. You be the stars. And you will stay up there until some man and some woman marry on this earth, and they never, never fight. The stars are still up there. So now you know. Our next story comes from Maben. It is an Inuit tale called Skeleton Woman. This version is adapted from a telling by Will Horniak and is used with his permission.
Far, far to the north, there lived a beautiful woman who was a fine dancer, poet, and artist. She thought that none of the men in her village were good enough for her, and she ridiculed them with nicknames such as brings home no game or drowned while kayaking. But one day, this very beautiful woman saw a hunter, a stranger, approaching her village. She watched as he walked across the broad expanse of the tundra, and as he drew near her, she could see that he wore a polar bear skin. He carried sharp knives on his belt, and he wore a necklace of polar bear teeth around his neck. He stayed in her village for some time, and in the evenings, he too could dance the dances and sing the songs. He spoke the poems most beautifully, and she was taken with him. So when the hunter left the village to go hunting, this very beautiful woman, she followed him. She followed him as he moved quickly across the tundra and out onto the ice floes. And there, when he came to the end of an ice floe, he simply dove into the cold, cold water, swam to the next ice floe, and pulled himself out. Now, this very beautiful woman was afraid, but she followed him and she dove into that cold water and swam to the ice floe. But when she got there, she was so cold and so numb that she could not pull herself out. She called out for help and looked up, but when she looked up, it was no longer a man she saw. That polar bear skin was now his skin. Those sharp knives were his claws, and that necklace of polar bear teeth, well, they were back in his mouth. He stood up on his hind legs and roared up into the sky, and then he dropped down on all fours and walked away. And that very beautiful woman, she could not pull herself out. She could not pull herself out. She could not pull herself out. And finally, she had to let go of the ice, and she drifted down, 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 down to the very bottom of the sea. And there, in the dark and the cold, she stayed for a very long time. Every day, the tides washed in and out and in and out, and with the tides came the crabs. They found her tender flesh, and in time, what with the watching of the tides and the coming of the crabs, that very beautiful woman was nothing more than a skeleton. One day, the tides rose so sharply that they lifted Skeleton Woman up, 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 and tossed her hands up onto an ice floe. Then Skeleton Woman realized she was so light that she could pull herself out. So she pulled herself up onto the ice floe, and she began to walk, with her bones clicking and clacking and rattling. The kelp wound around her ribs, was streaming out behind her, and her black hair, filled with barnacles, was blowing in the wind. She walked across those ice floes until she came to the tundra. And there, on the tundra, she found an abandoned hut. She mended the hut with the grasses of the tundra, and just in time, for the wind was beginning to blow and the snow was beginning to fly, and winter was there. And so she crept into that hut, curled up, and she slept. She slept and she slept and she slept. She slept and she dreamt, and she slept and she dreamt, and she slept and she dreamt for a very long time. She did not awaken until she could feel the warm air, until she could hear the bird songs, for then she knew that spring had come. But still, she stayed in her hut for some time. One day, she saw two young men. They were hunters coming by on a track near her, and she called out to them, "Come, and I will feed you." But when they arrived at her hut and she stood before them, nothing but a skeleton, they were terrified. They screamed, they ran. That night in their village, they saw their father, and they said, "Something very strange happened to us today. It was a woman. She invited us in for food, but when we came to her hut, she was nothing but a skeleton." Now, their father was an old man, a wise man, a shaman, whose wife had died many years before. And he said to his sons, now, that sounds like a woman I would like to meet. And so the next day, he took his frame drum and he began to walk, and he drummed and he walked and he walked and he drummed. He drummed and he walked and he walked and he drummed. Drummed and he walked and he walked and he drummed. And in time, skeleton woman, she could feel that drumming in her bones. He came to her hut and he called out to her, and she cried, go away, I'm nothing but bones. He said, it doesn't matter. I'm nothing but an old man. It took a great deal of courage for Skeleton Woman to do this, but she stood up and she went out of her hut and she stood before him. Nothing but bones. It didn't matter to him. They went into her hut and they talked. They talked for a long time. They talked of many things. And then the old man said, I have this drum, and sometimes when I play it, people like to dance. She said, I've forgotten how to dance. Well, he said, it might feel good. And so he picked up his drum and he began to play. And he played and he played and he played. And as she sat there in the dark, Skeleton Woman began to remember how she used to move. And as he played and he played, she stood up and she began to dance there in the dark. And he played and she danced all that night. All the next day and all the next night and all the next day and all the next night and all the next day and all the next night. And in the morning, he flung the flap of the hut open and the sun came streaming in, and Skeleton Woman, she could see that the flesh was back on her fingers. She could see that her hair was as dark and shining and lustrous as it had ever been. And she said to that old man, now, you give me that drum. And she took the drum and she began to play. And then she said to him, now you dance. And she played and he danced and he danced and he danced. He danced until his arms were strong, his heart was light, and he was soulful. And then that old man and that woman, they danced all the way back to the village. And the people say that they are dancing still to this very day, dancing through death into life, from death back into life again. And the Inuit people say that when you hear a frame drum, what you really hear is the old man and the woman dancing through death back into life again, from death back into life again. I wanted to share this story with you tonight because this is the story that helped me on my cancer journey. I was down there in that unconscious darkness for a long, long time and barely managed to bring myself back up to join in the dance of life again. Now, Barbara Fankhauser brings us a story of Una McCool, the little woman behind the giant. Finn McCool may have the brawn, but it's her brains that count when the chips are down. Cow chips, that is.
Thank you, Pam. That was a really beautiful story. I love your telling of it. Back when Ireland was populated by giants, there was one giant's name who stood out above all the others, and some of you may have heard of him, Finn McCool. Now, Finn McCool, he was one of the fiercest giants in Ireland. And in fact, he was so fierce, he was the chieftain of the Fianna, the most notoriously fierce fighting group the world has ever known. Now, he didn't just have bronze, though. I have to tell you that Finn McCool, as a young man, came across a man who had spent his life fishing for the salmon of knowledge. And the man had caught the fish and had it on a spit when young Finn came by. And the man was turning the spit with the fish on it. And the thing was that when he finished cooking the fish, he was going to eat it. And when he ate it, he would have all of the knowledge that this fish possessed. Well, he needed to prepare for this ceremony of eating the fish. And so he asked young Finn to turn the spit while he went and prepared. And so Finn did that, and he was turning the spit. But as young men sometimes do, he began to daydream a little bit, and he slowed and stopped. And when he looked back, there was a large blister that had formed on the side of the salmon where the flames had heated it too much. And well, he was nervous about the whole thing. So he took his thumb and he pushed that blister in. And when he did, the oil spilled out and scalded his tongue. And he put his thumb in his mouth, and all of the knowledge of that fish came into him. And so Finn was more than brawn. He had a knowledge, a wisdom. Every time he needed to know something for battle or for any kind of decision, and he knew. In fact, that's how he knew when he met Una that she was the woman that he should marry. She was they were as well matched as any couple could be. Now Una, she had her own kind of knowledge. She was a woman of the knowledge that came up from the earth and came down from the moon and came through the air. She had woman's knowledge, and she was Finn McCool's match in every way. And so they were well suited. Now, as time went on, a giant began to be heard of in the land. And the more Finn McCool
Unmute yourself. I goofed.
Okay. So Finn McCool heard about this other giant named Cuchulainn. And
Unmute yourself again. I did it again.
So, as I was saying, Finn McCool was a fierce giant with wisdom and a following of the army, and was well respected throughout the land. When he heard about this other giant, Cuchulainn. Now, Cuchulainn, I would say you'd classify him as a bully, because Cuchulainn was big and he was fierce, and his greatest joy was finding giants and smacking them down to the size of a cow patty, sticking them in his pocket, and walking around and using those giant cow patties to intimidate other giants. And he had his cap set on Finn McCool. He'd heard of Finn McCool's reputation and had began to pursue him. And Finn, well, thanks to his thumb, knew where Cuchulainn was most of the time and was able to avoid him. This went on for almost a year. And in that time, he had built a house for he and Una up on top of Knockmany Hill. And the reason he built it there is because he could see 360 degrees in all directions so that Cuchulainn could not sneak up on him. Now, the day that I'm going to tell you about, Una was at home sweeping out and doing the things that you do in your house. And she saw Finn coming up the hill at a lively pace, and could tell just by looking at him that something was up and he needed to consult with her. Well, he came in the house and he was really quite agitated, and so Una said, "No, settle down. What seems to be the trouble, Finn?" "Oh," he said, "it's Cuchulainn. He's coming for me. I tasted my thumb, and he's going to be here at 3 o'clock. He's going to be here at 3 o'clock, and I don't know what to do. Una said, calm down. I will handle this." Now, this was not the first time that Una had gotten Finn out of tight situations. First, she said, "Tell me when he's going to be here at 3 o'clock. Now, all right, you need to go to the neighbor's house and borrow 3 iron griddles. Just do that right now. I'll get you out of this, but you have to do what I tell you." Well, Finn, he disappeared to get these griddles from his neighbors. And when he got back, Una had a trough of bread dough working. And she got this bread dough and she took the griddles and she baked it inside of 3 loaves of bread. So there were 3 loaves of bread with griddles baked in the middle. And then she baked 3 more without griddles. And she put the ones with the griddles on one shelf and the others on the other shelf. Now she said, now tell me, Finn, where is Cuchulain's strength? And he said, the little finger of his right hand. All right, she said, that's good. Now, you put this little dress on and this bonnet, and you get in the crib over there, and you're going to be your own son. And keep your thumb in your mouth, and you'll know what I need you to do at the right time. And just settle down. It's going to be all right. So Finn, well, he was really frightened. He put the dress and the bonnet on. He climbed into the crib, and he pulled the blanket up. And by now, Una had looked out the window. She could see Cuchulain coming up the hill. And the closer he got, the more the earth began to shake, and his footsteps were pounding the earth. And Finn was in that crib, and he was shaking all over and pulled it up to his eyeballs. And he heard this pound on the door. And Una, she just walked over and opened it and said, yes, may I help you? I'm looking for Finn McCool. Oh, I'm so sorry. You just missed him. He heard about this pipsqueak of a giant named Cuchulain who was down there at the causeway, and he went down to confront him. I'm Cuchulain, and I am no pipsqueak, and I have been chasing your husband around Ireland for the last year, so don't tell me he's looking for me, because I've been looking for him. Oh, that's not really likely. Now, you're Cuchulain, huh? Well, Mr. Cuchulain, come in. He'll be along shortly, and you're more than welcome to stay here. You can certainly wait here for him. And she looked out the door at this point and licked her finger and stuck it outside. And she said, he won't be here probably for a little bit. And the wind has just shifted, coming out of the west now. And well, when Finn is here, when the wind comes out of the west, it chills the house. So I'm with the babe. I just want to keep it warm. So Finn will always turn the house for me. Would you be good enough to turn the house around facing the other direction? The woman said, he turns the house? Yes. Would you be able to do that? You think you could do that? Of course I can do that. If Finn McCool can do it, I could certainly do it. He stood up and he pulled that little finger 3 times, and he went out and he got his arms around the house, and he lifted that house and he turned it and set it down so it was facing the other direction. And, well, Finn was in the crib. He said, oh my gosh, he picked up the entire house, and Finn pulled the blanket up a little higher, and Cuchulain came back in the house, and I broken out a little bit of sweat on his forehead. And Una said, oh, it seems to have been a bit of an exertion for you. I'm so sorry, but why don't I put on a pot of tea? What am I thinking? My hospitality. I should, of course, have offered you a pot of tea before you did that. But here's my bucket. And the thing is, we have a little drought going on our hill. But if you look at that hill right over there, just close by over there, there's a rock on top of it, and there's a spring under that rock. If you'd be good enough to take the bucket over there and lift that rock out and fill my bucket with a spring underneath, then I'd be happy to make a pot of tea for you. Took the bucket and he went down the hill, and he came up the other side of the hill, and when he got there he realized the rock was a little bigger than it looked from a distance. It was as tall as he was and twice as wide. And he put the bucket down and he pulled that finger 9 times because it was a pretty big rock. Got that rock and he put his legs into it, and he lifted that rock, and it was like taking a tooth out, because the bottom of the rock went down another 10 feet into the earth. And then he lifted it out and he set it aside, and the spring came bubbling up and sent a stream down the side of the mountain. And well, he scooped up a bucket of water, and he came back up to Knockmoney Hill and handed the water to Una. And she said, oh, now sit down. You've obviously exerted yourself a great deal. Sit down and I'll put the tea on. In the meantime, here's a nice loaf of bread that you could have and start on that, because you look a little peckish. Well, indeed he was. And Cuchulain picked up that loaf of bread and he went, I slammed his teeth into it. Taking out 2 of my teeth, he said. What kind of bread is this? Oh, said Una, boy, it's Finn's favorite bread. He loves that bread. I'm sorry that you don't have the jaws that my husband has, but well, here's another loaf. Try this one. Perhaps this one will be better. He handed him another loaf, and he took a big bite out of it, and then he screamed, and 3 teeth. I've lost 5 teeth on your bread. Oh, she said, I can't say what's wrong with your jaws, but Finn just loves this. So does the babe. At that point, Finn was in the crib with his thumb in his mouth. He heard that he knew exactly what she wanted. He pulled the thumb out. He went, Mama! Oh, you awakened the babe now and now. And Finn then said, Cake! Oh, she said, he's hungry. He loves the same bread. She took a loaf, the same looking loaf of bread that she just given to Crone, and handed it to Finn and that cradle, and he just ate it right down. But Crone watched that, and then she took another cake, piece of loaf of bread off, and handed it to the baby, and he just ate that one right down too. And now Crone stood up and was thinking to himself, that's Finn McCool's baby, and he could eat that bread that broke 5 of my teeth. And about then, the babe's leg kind of kicked out of the cradle, and he saw this massive leg on this baby. He thought, oh, that's Finn McCool's baby's leg. I can't even imagine what Finn McCool's legs look like. Well, so he said, you know, Mrs. McCool, perhaps this isn't a good idea right now to meet your husband right now. Perhaps I should just be on my way, and I can catch you at a later time. Oh, she said, yes, but now the babe's awake. Come and look at him. He's just the spitting image of his father. Look at that. You know, he's getting new teeth in there. They're kind of in the back. You should reach in and feel those teeth. And Crone put his hand into the baby's mouth, and a moment later he pulled it out, and that finger was gone. Oh, and in a moment he began to shrink down, and he was no bigger than, well, a human. And Una stood towering over him, looked at him, and laughed at that little man who turned pale and ran down Knockmany Hill and was never seen in Ireland again. And Una, she turned to her husband and said, I told you it would be all right. And I tell you, there's nothing like brains when it comes to, if brains are brawn, you want to go with the brains every time. And that's the story of Una and Una the giant. And our next teller is Anne Penfound, who's going to be telling us a story of the Queen Dowager based on memories of a Queen Dowager based on a Persian Armenian folktale.
Welcome, everyone, back to the second half of our show. If you're sitting comfortably, then I will begin. My husband passed away a short while ago, and I was given a new name, if you like. I was given the name of Dowager Queen, and I was given a new house, a cottage, the Dowager's Cottage. When I moved in, I brought with me all my treasures, all my special keepsakes to help me remember the past. And I want to tell you about them, but my memory sometimes is a little bit fuzzy. And so if I am, or if I hear a strange noise, I get distracted easily. So I brought me these treasures, and the one treasure that I brought was my shepherdess's crook. It reminded me of when I was a maid and how I took my sheep into the hills, and I enjoyed my life as a shepherdess. And I also have a water tankard, and that reminds me of that I met my husband down at the well. Now, of course, I didn't know he was going to be my husband, but when I was drawing water, this young man came galloping up on his horse, desperate for a drink, hot and bothered, and he took his tankard and he dipped it into the bucket that I had just brought up. And I thought, no! I reached for it and poured that water back into my bucket because it was so hot and the water was so cold. I did it not once. I did it twice, 3 times. And I could feel his attitude change. He was getting angry with me. I knew that. And when I looked up into his eyes, they were steely. And he said, "Is it a custom in your village to tease a man who wants to slake his thirst?" I looked up. I forced myself to look into those steely eyes, and I said, "No, sir, I was not teasing you. The water was cold and you were so hot. And I didn't want you to come to any harm." And as I watched, his eyes changed into understanding, almost admiration. And he said to me, "What is your name?" And proudly I told him, "I am the shepherdess Anit." "And you, sir, your name?" But he wouldn't tell me. He said I would know soon enough. Well, soon enough was long enough for me to forget all about him. So you can imagine my surprise when an emissary came to my cottage from the king with a written proposal of marriage. The king had written, "The king requests the hand in marriage for his son, Prince Vacheron, to the shepherdess Anit." I mean, who wants a written proposal of marriage, even if it is from a king? Where is the romance? I wanted the romance when somebody proposed to me. And so, quick as a flash, I said to the emissary, "And what trade, pray, does Prince Vacheron have?" You should have seen his face. He went, and he took very tall, and he said, "Prince Vacheron is the king's son, and royalty do not have a trade. They have servants for that." Well, my impetuous mouth got the best of me, and I said, "Well, you can tell the Prince Vacheron that I will not marry any man unless he has a trade, because a prince can be a prince today and a pauper tomorrow." And the emissary went back to report to the king, obviously. I probably burned my boats because, I did realize that the king and queen probably wanted their son to marry a princess of high standing, not a lowly shepherdess. But apparently, Vacheron had a different idea altogether. And when he got the message, he gathered together the advisors of the palace and the master craftsmen, and he said to them, "What trade would be suitable for a prince?" And when they talked about it, they came to the conclusion that a suitable trade would be carpet maker. Well, Vacheron, he applied himself with a dedication, and within a year he had mastered the art of carpet making. And he came to my cottage with his servants, of course, with a carpet, and he laid it at my feet. It was the most wonderful carpet, full of garden flowers and all the colors that you could imagine. And it was interlaced with gold and silver thread, and it was so beautiful. And you know what he did? He got down on bended knees and he asked me to marry him. I mean, how could I refuse? Of course, I said yes. I said yes. I said yes. And so opened for me a whole new world. Now, Vacheron was a very wise and a kind young man, and he introduced me to the protocol I needed to live with the royal family. He took me to places I'd never been in the land before, and he taught me to weave carpets. We developed a secret language. We called it the language of carpets. And we could send messages to each other and no one would know what we were saying or read what we were saying. You know, I had a hand loom in my study, and I would make small tapestries where I would declare my ardent love for my prince. And nobody could read it but him and me. I made some of those tapestries into a cushion, and I have it with me to this day. But I blush to think of some of the things that I wrote in that tapestry. Ooh, the impetuousness of youth. When Vacheron's family, mother and father died, we became king and queen. He was the king and I was his queen. And the people loved Vacheron because he was just, he was kind. And the country was at peace with him as ruler. Until one year we heard some strange mutterings that something was going on. Something, the men of the able-bodied men of the country were disappearing. Mothers would come complaining that their sons had just disappeared into thin air. Wives whose husbands had gone out to business never came home. And it got so bad that I suggested to Vacheron that he should go in disguise out into the countryside and talk to the people, the rich and the poor, and try and find out what was going on. He said he would, and he did, leaving me to rule in his stead. Now, he was gone a long time, and I didn't find out what happened until he came home. But he told me that one day he went into a busy town, to the marketplace, and as he looked around, he saw in the middle of the square a group of men surrounding two priests who were chanting in a very hypnotic way. The men were silent, and everywhere the priests went, the men went. And as the priests made their way out of the city, then the men followed, and Vacheron followed too. But he told me that chant that the priest it was making him so that he couldn't concentrate. And so he decided to make a chant of his own inside his head. And he would say, my queen, Anit, my queen, Anit, my love, Anit, my queen. And he kept on repeating that in his head as the group moved towards the foothills. And they came across this, it looked like a temple with big red gates. The priest took a key from his robes and turned the key of that gate, and the gate swung open. And the men followed the priests inside like silent sheep. And Vacheron slipped in. And then the gates were closed and the priest stopped chanting. And the men seemed to awake to themselves. They were in a dark and dank cavern. There were strange and noxious smells, and the sound of and the cries of distraught men who they couldn't see. The priest turned on them and said, which one of you, how many of you have a trade? Those of you that had a trade, step forward. Those that do not, go with my colleague, the priest there, and he will take you down to the depths of the caverns where you will help with the fires, and you will do the manual labor of this prison. And the men began to look at each other, not knowing what to do. And Vacheron stepped forward and he said, we are all tradespeople. We are carpet makers. We make the most marvelous carpets, the colorful carpets, the most magnificent carpets you have ever seen in your life. And the priest turned to him and sneered, and he said, if that is true, all will be well. we will bring you the tools of your trade. But if it is not true, then you will be flayed alive. So they bought all the tools, all the equipment that they needed into the small cavern, which was very poorly lit. The loom and the shuttle and the threads and the wool all were bought into that cavern. And Vacheron began to organize the men. They worked in teams. He was always there to advise and show how they should weave this carpet. They worked as a team morning and night in different shifts, but they worked as a team so that no one would stand out. If someone was sick, they would keep them from the prying eyes of the priest. If someone was too weak to stand, they would support them. And so they worked day in, day out. And they made this carpet. It was the most colorful carpet that they had seen, that anyone had seen. And the priests were absolutely amazed by it. And then Vacheron said, "This is not a carpet for an ordinary man. This is a carpet for some discerning person, like Queen Anit. She would understand the colorful language of this carpet, the colors that we have interwoven. She would cherish this carpet. She would pay you." And so the greedy priests rolled up that carpet and they brought it to my palace. And when my courtiers saw it, they, so magnificent was it. So wonderful were the colors. But it was a carpet. I already had my favorite carpet that Vacheron had woven for me when he pledged his troth. I wasn't interested in another carpet. I was more worried about my Vacheron because he had been gone for over a year. I did not know where he was or how he fared. The priest, noticing my distraction, began to extol the virtues of the carpet. He said, the man that oversaw the making of this carpet said that this would be a carpet that you, and only you, would appreciate, my queen. That you would be able to read the language of the carpet, to admire its colors. The language of the carpet. And so I began to look at that carpet. It was Vacheron. Vacheron had helped made this carpet, and he had sent me a message. He was imprisoned by these priests. And please, this was where he was imprisoned, and he knew that I could come and rescue him. Well, you know those priests. I threw them into the deepest dungeon and prayed that they rot in hell. And then I gathered my army together and rode out in front of them to the place that Vacheron had told me. The priests that were there thought we were bringing more prisoners, so they just opened the gates and in we went. And we captured all those priests. And then there was a cry from within as the men began to stream out of those gates into the daylight. They had to put their hands over their eyes because it was so bright and it had been so dark. I kept looking for Vacheron, but he was the last person to leave that cavern, and he was carrying a man who could not walk. I flung myself into his arms and we hugged and hugged. And he said, this is my queen. This is Anit, my queen. She has saved us. And the men began to call out, "Praise Anit, Anit, our queen, praise Anit." And my husband said, "Yes, it is thanks to her that I can weave a carpet, and I could teach you, and now you are all carpet makers." She insisted that I learn a trade before she would marry me. It is wonderful that she insisted. And now we are saved. And the men went back to their families and their wives, and I took Vacheron home with me. It took him a long time to recover, but we had many years after that together, and the country was settled again. But now he has passed, and I am alone. And I have these special treasures, especially the carpet, because I see it every day. And I have hung it on the wall in one of my rooms so that when I see it, I remember my life and how lucky I am. My life from maid to crone. And I give thanks every day because he led me to a most wonderful life. Thank you. Oh, and I have to introduce someone now. Imagine that. Please welcome back Julie Strozyk as Baba Yaga.
Unmute yourself.
Many people ask me, Baba, why do you live in the woods all by yourself? Many people ask me, why are you so far away? And tonight I have people asking me, why do you live so far away and you have such bad bandwidth? But never mind. That is not the point of my tale. The point of my story is, once upon a time, I lived in a village with other people. Yes. I had neighbors. I actually had a couple of farm animals. I had a horse, a very nice horse. But I did have one neighbor. Yeah, I think you know what I mean. That one neighbor that gives you a lot of trouble, always talking, always disturbing your peace. Yeah. That was Olga. Olga came to me one day. One of my horses was sick and had been sick for a while. And Olga came and said, "Oh, Baba, you should call the new priest at the church. He is a learned man. He is a holy man. I bet that he could tell you how to cure your horse." I am not a religious person. I did not really want to talk to the priest, but Olga was so insistent. In fact, one day when I was treating the horse, Olga shows up with the priest in tow. Now, when I thought about the priest, I figured he would be an old man with a long beard. That's the way the priests in Russia always are, the long beard. And when I looked at this priest, I discovered, well, no, he was dressed in his black cassock, but he didn't have a long beard. He barely had a beard at all. I think I have more of a beard than he had, you know? Well, the priest looked at the horse, and Olga told me, oh, this is going to be wonderful, Baba. He's going to cure your horse. Well, I looked at that priest, that young man, and I could tell he was very uncomfortable. He didn't want to look at the horse. He didn't know anything about horses. But he looked at the horse. He looked in the horse's mouth. He looked at the horse's legs. He petted the horse. He walked around the horse 3 times. Then he just said, well, either the horse will live or it will die. And he left. I thought that was probably the best thing he could have said. Well, the horse, of course, got better, but it got better because of my treatments. I know how to cure animals. And so it was. The priest lived in the village with us for a number of years. And then word went around that the priest was not well. He was having trouble with his throat. It was like he had some kind of an abscess or something in his throat that wouldn't allow him to breathe. And he was barely able to speak. He was very, very ill. And somebody said, Mama, you should go see the priest. See if you can give him a treatment, a cure. He's a good man. Please go and see. So I packed up my potions and my charms, and I went to see the priest. He was in bed. He looked pretty bad. I looked at him. I touched his throat. I looked down his throat. I looked at him all up and down. Finally, I walked around the bed 3 times. And then I said, well, either he will live or he will die. And then the priest, remembering those words, those very words that he had said about my horse, he began to laugh. And he laughed and he laughed. He laughed so hard that the abscess in his throat broke open. And then he coughed and he coughed, and the abscess cleared itself. And he could breathe again. And so Baba cured the priest. And although they say laughter is the best medicine, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But I think this time it definitely was. And now, our last crone is Allison Cox, sharing a tale from her books, The Healing Heart. This particular tale is an adaptation of Celia Lottridge's story of the Pincoa child.
Thank you so much, Julie. I really enjoyed laughing with you. Well, once, long ago in another time, there was an old woman who lived in a little rock house along the southern shore of Chile. I hear somebody that's not muted, so if you could mute yourselves, I'll keep going. She was old. She was so old that almost everyone she knew, her family, her friends, had all died or moved away. And the people in the village that lived up on the bluff above her beach, they almost forgot that she was there at all. But it did not matter. She was so old that she could not even garden. But she got most of everything she needed from the sea. Every day she would put her basket on her arm and she would head out across the beach. And there she would gather shellfish from the tidal pools or seaweed, or she'd pick up the pieces of driftwood that were small enough for her to gather. Oh, and she loved the bright days when the sky was blue and the sea would sparkle. But she was not afraid of storms. When the storms came, she would sit wrapped in her shawl next to her fire, and she would think about all the things that would come on the beach, all the treasures that she'd find the next day. Once she had found an iron cook pot. Another time she had found a rug with the corner torn off. And another time she had found a piece of fishnet that she could use to dredge the tidal pools. Well, one night in the early summer, there came a storm unlike any that the old woman ever remembered. It seemed as though the wind and the waves were trying to lift her little house up from the foundation, and the wind kept tucking the smoke back down her chimney. But she just wrapped up in her warmest shawl, and she closed her eyes, and she kept thinking about all the treasures she would find the next day. And sure enough, the next morning, the wind was just a gentle breeze, and the sea was calm, and she put her basket on her arm, and she went out, and oh, there were fish and shrimp in the tidal pools, and there was plenty of seaweed to gather, and there were even pieces of driftwood that were small enough for her to carry. And when she got to the farthest pool, there she found the greatest treasure of all, a giant crab, a centola crab. Oh, she said, this will make a fine meal. And so she lifted it up and she put it into the top of her basket, and then she headed home. Well, no sooner did she get home than she started to prepare that crab to eat for a meal. And she started to pry off the top of the shell, but when she opened it, what she found there was not what she expected, for inside the crab shell was a baby. And the baby looked at her with gray eyes the color of the stormy sea. The baby was smaller than she remembered babies being, and it had red hair like some of the people in that part of Chile. But instead of legs, the baby had a long, silvery tail like a fish. Oh, I can't be seeing this. I must be dreaming, she said. And so she told herself, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. But when she opened her eyes again, the baby was still there, and now it was smiling at her and holding out its little arms towards her, and she said, whatever am I to do with you? But then she made a decision. And so she picked up the child and wrapped it in some cloth and put it in her basket, put the basket on her arm, and for the first time in years, she started up the trail that went along the bluff towards the village, because she remembered there was always a wise woman that lived in the house at the edge of the village, and surely she would know what to do. Well, when she arrived, it seemed like the wise woman knew who she was and why she was coming. She said, come in, you need my help. Tell me, what can I do for you? And so the old woman simply handed the basket to the wise woman, and the wise woman took it, and she looked, oh, a baby. And she lifted the child up, and as she did, her eyes got wider, but she didn't say anything. She put that child in the crook of her arm and let the baby's little tiny hand wrap around just the tip of her finger, and with her other hand she traced the child's round face and ruffled her red curls. And then she said, you have found a child of the Penkoya, the sea people. It must have been blown ashore in all the storm last night, those waves and that wind. But if you take this child and leave her on the rocks at the edge of the sea, her people will come for her and take her home. So the old woman nodded and gave her some shellfish she had collected as a thank you, and took the child, put her in the basket, and headed down the bluff trail and all the way across the beach till she got to the very end where she had found that crab. And there was a rock jutting out over the water there with an indent in the top of it. So she lined that indent with seaweed so it would be soft, and then put the child on the rock, and immediately the child seemed to be still and quiet, mesmerized by looking at the water. And then she turned and thought, I can't leave a baby on the rocks. And so she decided to go back a bit and hide behind a rock where she could see the child and still see the water, and she waited. And for the longest time, all she saw out there on the waves was foam. But then she saw what looked like red seaweed coming in closer and closer until she realized as it surfaced just before that rock that it was the red hair of the Penkoya. But the Penkoya did not reach for the child. Instead, she sang in a voice that sounded like the sighing of the wind. And the old woman felt compelled to come out from behind the rock and come forward until she stood next to the child. And then the Penkoya spoke to her in her own language. She said, "Oh, women of the land, please help me. My child was born weak and small. The sea wolves, they are thick this year. I fear for her safety. Please keep her with you until she grows stronger and bigger, and then she can come back to me." The old woman said, "Oh, I am too old for babies. And what do I know about a Penkoya child? I don't know what they eat. No, I'm just too old." "But you have already cared for her. I can leave plants here on the rocks," said the Penkoya, and you can feed them to her every day. Please do it for my child." The old woman, she looked at the baby, and of course now the baby was looking at her with those big gray eyes, and she was reaching for the old woman and laughing, and the old woman said, "All right, I will do it for you and for the baby." And the Penkoya said, "Oh," and she held her hands to her heart and then reached them out as if to say thank you, and then she dove under the water and was gone. And the old woman looked at the child and said, "Whatever I used to know about raising babies, I have long forgotten. Let's go home." And so she picked the child up and put her in the basket, and they did exactly that. And the old woman made a little bed just next to her bed for that child. And every day when she went out to the beach, well, the baby rode in the basket, and then she took her out and laid her on the beach, and there she would look up at the seagulls and squawk at them and try to reach them with her hands, and she'd play with the shells and the starfish. If she got to the edge of the wave, she'd splash. And sometimes the old woman would stop and sit on a rock nearby instead of gathering more food, and she'd roll pebbles to the child. And other times she'd pick her up and take her over to the bluff wall and point out the flowers that grew there and the lizards that ran between the cracks in the rocks, and so many things that a child of the sea would never know. And in the evening, the old woman would often sit on the big driftwood log near her house, and as the sun went down and the moon rose, she would try to sing that baby to sleep, and after a while, the songs that she used to sing to her babies came back to her. "Big moon, bright moon, shining so very high, a in the starry sky. Big moon, bright moon, can you see people as tiny as I? And the Penkoya child, oh, she loved to listen to the old woman's voice. And day by day, that child grew bigger and stronger. And the old woman couldn't fit her in her basket anymore. Well, she had to hike her up on her hip and carry her out to the beach and then put her down, and the child would crawl alongside, pushing with her tail. And one day the old woman, she looked down and she saw how much bigger that child was, how much stronger she was. And she knew it was time for her to go back to the sea. And so the next morning, she hiked that child up on her hip, and she had every intention of taking her across the beach to that hollow in the rock. But for some reason, instead, her feet took her entirely different direction, and she found herself climbing up the trail and all the way to the wise woman's house. And the wise woman was sitting in the sun outside her door. And when she saw them coming, she reached up her hands to take the baby. And soon she had that child on her lap, and she was bouncing her and getting her to giggle and laugh. And the old woman leaned forward and said, "See how happy she is. See how strong and healthy. Surely she should stay with me." And the wise woman said, "Oh, she is happy, and she is so strong and healthy. You have done a fine job. But she is a Penkoya's child, and she will grow up to be a Penkoya. Her people need her. You need to give her back to the sea." And the old woman nodded, and she took the child, and she started back down the path and all the way to the other end of the beach. And there she lined that hollow in the rock with seaweed. And she put the child right there, and the child just became still, looking out at the water expectantly. And this time the old woman did not hide. She stood there beside the child and waited. And after a time she could see off in the distance what looked like red seaweed coming closer and closer and closer into the land. And then the Penkoya surfaced before the rock. And this time she reached up and held the cheek of her baby. And she turned to the old woman and said, "Oh, she is strong. She is so healthy. Now she can be safe again. I will never forget you." And then she put her hands to her heart and gave her thanks again. And then she took the child off the rock, and no sooner was the child in the water than she flipped and was gone. And the Penkoya dove right after her. And that was the last time the old woman ever saw the Penkoya or her child. But life for her after that was never the same, because every day all the driftwood would always come up on the beach at her end of the beach, right near her little stone house, and it was always the size that she could carry. And each of the tidal pools were always filled with fish and shrimp, and there was plenty of seaweed to collect. And sometimes in the evening, when she would sit on that driftwood log, well, the wise woman would come down the bluff trail and sit there with her. And together they'd talk, and sometimes they'd see in the distance what looked like red seaweed on the waves, and they knew what it was. Yes. And sometimes it seemed to the old woman that the murmuring of the waves carried a tune that sounded just like the tune that she had once sung to the Penkoya's child. Big moon, bright moon, shining so very high, up in the starry sky. Big moon, bright moon, can you see people as tiny as I? So now I want to bring the rest of our tellers back on screen. And I want to thank Julie Strozyk and Penfound, Pam Maben, Barb Fankhauser for joining me tonight in our storytelling. And I want to thank all of you for being there as our audience, because otherwise we're all just talking to ourselves. And just want to remind you one last time before we open this up so that you can talk to the tellers that if you want to make a donation, go to seattlestorytellers.org, scroll down to the donation jar, and then send us a little note that you'll see. You can send a note there. There, Barry's got it up on the page. Because we're going to have some great programming coming up. We're going to have Sheila Arnold. We're going to have Carmen Agrediti. It's all to celebrate our 40th year of being a guild. So